The night shift at Cedar Creek Medical in Atlanta moves like a held breath, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical song above corridors where most people sleep, where most people forget that hospitals never actually close. Sarah Chen arrives at 11:33 p.m., badge clipped to her scrubs, moving through the automatic doors with the kind of invisibility that comes from being underestimated every single day. Her left leg favors slightly as she walks, the old injury from Kandahar barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it, and no one here is looking for anything except the next shift change. She pushes a supply cart through Bay 3, restocking for kits with mechanical precision, her hands moving through the choreography of the night shift so practiced that her mind exists somewhere else entirely. A 14-gauge needle placed just so. Saline bags arranged by expiration date. The cart's wheels squeak against the polished tile, a sound she's come to find strangely comforting, the same rhythm every 3 hours. Most of the day staff has never learned her first name. She prefers it that way. The Pentagon embedded her here 6 weeks ago, and staying invisible means mission success. The nursing credential is real, for years at Emory, board certified, genuinely qualified, but the mission underneath is intelligence gathering. Cedar Creek Medical has become a hunting ground. Dr. Marcus Mercer appears at the nurse's station as Sarah passes, his white coat pristine as fresh snow, his posture the kind that comes from never questioning whether he deserves the space he takes up. She doesn't look at him directly. She never does. That's part of the strategy. Mercer pauses over a patient chart, his jaw tightening slightly as he reads, then he closes the folder with deliberate control. Whatever he just saw has registered as a problem. Sarah continues moving her supply cart toward the next bay, her pace unchanged, her breathing steady. 32 years old, and she's learned that the most dangerous thing a woman can be in a hospital is observant. Mercer doesn't see the surgical precision in her technique. He doesn't see the way her hands remain steady during procedures that would make nursing students' hands tremble. What he sees is someone pushing a cart. What he sees is useful. Room 304 holds a patient named Holloway, grizzled, weathered, the kind of face that has seen combat and come out the other side harder. Sarah knows from his chart that he's a retired combat medic, 23 years of service, 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. He watches her work with the attention of someone who understands medical precision at a level most civilians never will. When a patient in Bay 2 develops shallow breathing and decreased breath sounds on the left side, Sarah is there before the resident finishes his assessment. Tension pneumothorax. Minutes to live if they don't decompress the lung now. The resident hesitates, protocol, hierarchy, the weight of not wanting to exceed his scope, but Sarah is already moving. She doesn't ask. She doesn't explain. Her hands find the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and she inserts the 14-gauge angiocath needle with the kind of muscle memory that comes from field medicine in Helmand Province, where you don't have time to doubt yourself because doubt costs lives. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space is unmistakable. Immediate. The patient's breathing changes in seconds. O2 sat climbing from 78 to 84 to 92, stable at 96. The resident's face shifts from panic to shock to something like gratitude. Holloway watches the entire sequence from his bed in room 304, and later, when his visitor, a woman Sarah assumes is his daughter, comes by during evening hours, he leans toward her and whispers something that makes her eyes go wide. Sarah catches fragments, not nursing school, field surgery, that's not a standard technique. Holloway knows. He knows exactly what he just witnessed because he's performed the same procedure under fire. The night shift paperwork demands precision. Sarah sits at the nursing station at 1:33 a.m., the only nurse on the floor, the only sound the keyboard clicking beneath her fingers as she documents patient observations. The infection rate data haunts her, she's been tracking it for 4 weeks, comparing Mercer's post-operative complications against the national database. Sepsis at twice the expected rate. Wound infections in 18% of his surgical patients versus the standard 3%. Urinary tract infections, surgical site infections, line infections. The numbers don't lie, but they also don't make sense unless something else is happening underneath. The charting is impeccable, of course. Mercer's technical notes are flawless. But the outcomes tell a different story, and Sarah has learned that outcomes are the truth that charts sometimes hide. She includes her observations in her own documentation, careful, factual, without accusation. Just data. Just numbers. Post-operative day 3, patient developing fever and elevated WBC. Recommend blood cultures and broad-spectrum antibiotics pending results. Patient for in Dr. Mercer's surgical schedule this month presenting with similar presentation. Procedural inconsistencies noted in charting, discrepancies between operative notes and post-operative care orders. She keeps her language clinical, her tone neutral, her implications buried deep enough that only someone specifically looking for them would find them. Which is the point. The Pentagon didn't send Captain Sarah Chen here to accuse anyone. They sent her to document patterns. To build a case. To wait. The cardboard box under her locker holds one piece of her real identity, a folded flag, burial flag from a ceremony in Arlington National Cemetery, 18 months ago, for Specialist Jacob Torres, Kandahar, IED, 23 years old. Her spotter. Her teammate. The boy she held while the medic worked to stop bleeding that wouldn't stop. She keeps it wrapped in plastic, sealed away, because looking at it too long makes the mission harder, and the mission is everything right now. Cedar Creek Medical has become a temporary address in a temporary life. Once she documents the billing fraud, once she proves that Mercer's inflated procedures and unnecessary surgeries are generating hundreds of thousands in fraudulent VA charges, once she builds the case that will put him in federal prison, she can go somewhere else and be invisible in a different building. Mercer enters the nursing station at 2:17 a.m., the fluorescent lights casting his face in shadows that make him look like something carved from bone and arrogance. He reviews charts in silence, his fingers tracing notes, his expression darkening incrementally. He pauses on Sarah's documentation. Of course he does. The infection rate observations, the procedural irregularities, the pattern recognition that she's laid out in clinical language, he's reading her work now, and she can see the moment he understands that someone on this floor is paying attention to things he would prefer remained invisible. His eyes shift toward her. She doesn't look up from the patient monitor she's checking. Your charting is becoming verbose, Mercer says. His voice carries the kind of weight that comes from knowing he can say almost anything and people will accept it. This hospital doesn't need editorial commentary from nursing staff. We chart interventions. We don't interpret data. Sarah types one more line into the EMR. Her jaw tightens slightly, barely perceptible. Post-operative complications should be documented. Her voice remains steady, professional, the voice of someone whose scope includes accurate medical record keeping. Standard of care. I'll decide what constitutes standard of care. Mercer closes the chart with decisive finality. Your job is implementation, not analysis. He leaves. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song. Sarah continues her documentation, her hand steady, her breathing unchanged. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened in those 3 seconds, Mercer reading her observations, Mercer recognizing that someone was watching him, had just transformed her from invisible night shift nurse into a problem that needed solving. She'd known it would happen eventually. You can't investigate someone without them eventually detecting that they're being investigated. The mission just entered its critical phase, and Sarah Chen, who survived 7 years of covert operations in hostile territory, understood that the real danger was about to begin. Thursday morning arrived like any other, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical monotone above the Cedar Creek Medical conference room where 23 residents and attending physicians filled every seat. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood at the front, manila folder in hand, his tailored suit catching the light like polished armor. Sarah stood against the back wall, invisible as always, her tablet clutched to her chest. Mercer opened the folder slowly, deliberately, the kind of theatrical pause that made junior residents sit straighter. This, he announced, holding up her charting from 3 weeks prior, is what dangerous overreach looks like. His voice dripped condescension, each word measured and lethal. He read aloud from her clinical notes questioning post-surgical sepsis rates, his inflection transforming her observations into accusations. A nurse writing surgical analysis. Questioning physician judgment. Suggesting protocol modifications. He looked up, scanning the room. Nurses who think their doctors put patients at risk. The resident snickered. One whispered loud enough to carry "Bedpan Brigade," and 3 others smiled at the joke. Sarah's hands gripped her tablet until her knuckles went white, the plastic edge biting into her palms. Her jaw clenched once, then released. Her face remained neutral, a mask so perfectly composed it could have belonged to a statue in a museum. But inside her chest, beneath the scrubs and underneath 7 years of training to absorb insult without reaction, something shifted. Not anger. Not shame. Information. The kind of information that soldiers catalog and file and use later. Mercer continued speaking for another 8 minutes, dismantling her credibility line by line while the residents watched and learned that it was acceptable to humiliate someone too junior to fight back. When he finished, he returned her charting to the folder with the satisfied smile of a man who'd just eliminated a threat. Sarah waited until he left the room before she turned and walked out, her boots clicking precisely against the tile floor in rhythm with the fluorescent light's electrical hum. 2 days later, Thursday afternoon bleeding into evening, Sarah stood at the vending machine outside the ICU during shift change. The hallway stretched long and quiet, most staff having cleared out for the next rotation. She'd been reaching for chamomile tea when his voice came from behind her, familiar and unmistakable. Maybe you people are better suited for bedpans than clinical decisions. Dr. Mercer blocked her path, his shoulder against the machine's corner, forcing her to either back away or turn and face him. His tone made it clear he was recalibrating the power dynamic, reminding her of her place. You people. The phrase hung in the air like a slap. He smiled, a controlled expression that revealed his teeth but not his warmth. I'm looking out for you, actually. This job is beyond your scope. Sarah took one measured breath. Just one. Her diaphragm expanded slowly, filling her lungs with recycled hospital air that tasted like antiseptic and condescension. A single tear escaped down her cheek, not from fear, not from shame, but from something deeper, something that came from the weight of 7 years pretending to be small. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving in one fluid motion across her skin. Her eyes never left his. The tear had been a choice, a tactical decision, letting him see a fraction of what he wanted to see before she took it back. The only thing dangerous here, Dr. Mercer, she said, her voice devastatingly calm, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has already survived the worst the world has to offer, is how many of your surgical patients develop sepsis at twice the national average. His face reddened instantly, color flooding from his neck upward like a thermometer rising. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the vending machine's mechanical hum and the distant ping of an arriving elevator. Sarah held his gaze, unblinking, her composure absolute. He turned without responding and walked away, his footsteps echoing sharply down the corridor. She purchased her tea and returned to the unit, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her breathing controlled. The combat medic from room 304, recovering from a perforated intestine, watched her pass his window and noticed something he hadn't seen before, the way she moved through space like someone who'd learned to move through it with purpose. The following week brought the fallout. Sarah was finishing a routine assessment when Dr. Mercer appeared at the nursing station during a code response, his timing deliberately public. 12 residents circled the trauma bay where a patient's heart monitor showed erratic rhythm. Sarah had just stabilized the patient's peripheral line when Mercer's voice cut through the controlled chaos. Your unauthorized interventions will be reported to administration, he announced, loud enough that every resident turned to listen. I'm documenting this as an insubordination incident. He stood in the doorway, his presence suddenly occupying the entire space. I'm trying to make this easy for you, he said with a surgical smile, the kind surgeons practice on their own patients right before delivering bad news. Leave quietly, or leave in handcuffs. Your choice. He wasn't yelling. That was the worst part. His tone remained perfectly professional, each word clipped and precise, making the threat sound reasonable. This hospital can't have people practicing outside their scope. especially given recent concerns about your competency. A folder appeared in his hands as if by magic, a manila, thick, already filled with papers. She didn't need to look inside to know what they contained. She'd been expecting this since the morning he'd first seen her questions about infection rates. The residents watched, absorbing the lesson, challenge authority, and authority responds with bureaucracy and threat. Sarah glanced at the folder without expression, then back to her patient. "Understood, doctor," she said quietly, her tone deferential, a nurse accepting correction from her superior. But as Mercer turned to leave, as he walked back down the corridor satisfied with his leverage, the combat medic from room 304 appeared in his wheelchair at the trauma bay entrance. He was still healing, still restricted to the unit, but he'd maneuvered himself here anyway. His eyes tracked Sarah's movements, the way she'd performed that decompression, the angle of her hands, the speed of her decision-making. He'd seen field medicine performed. He'd served with people trained to make life-and-death decisions in 60 seconds with minimal equipment. Recognition dawned in his weathered face, a slow and certain understanding. Sarah completed her charting, logged the code result as stabilized, and moved to the next patient assignment. Her phone sat silent in her scrub pocket, her Pentagon handler waiting for her next report. Any blown cover meant mission failure. Any exposure meant Mercer could walk free, his billing fraud never prosecuted, his exploitation of veterans never stopped. The Ranger captain in Bay 4, still sedated from the emergency decompression 3 days ago, remained connected to his ventilator, his medical bracelet showing his unit, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, same battalion Sarah served with in Helmand Province. Their paths had never crossed there. She'd been embedded in a different AO, different timeline, different mission. But the universe had a way of closing circles. She stood at the medication cart and pulled up the captain's post-operative orders, her eye scanning his vitals without expression. Her handler's warning echoed through her memory with the clarity of a command: any investigation into Mercer becomes a liability if it compromises your position. You extract when we tell you to extract. Not before. Not because a doctor humiliated you. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their endless electrical song, and Sarah Chen, the woman in scrubs everyone overlooked, pulled up her next assignment. The overhead PA crackled at 2:16 a.m. Not a request. Not a warning. A command. Mass casualty incident, I-85 northbound. 12 critical inbound. All trauma bays stand by. The Cedar Creek Medical ER transformed in 11 seconds. Overhead lights snapped to full brightness. Crash carts wheeled into position. The charge nurse called out assignments like a quarterback calling plays. Sarah Chen moved without hesitation, her hands already reaching for trauma shears, for kits, pressure dressings. Muscle memory took over. Not nursing school muscle memory. Field medicine muscle memory. Bay 4, trauma team standing by, the charge nurse announced, pointing. Bay 4 was where they brought the ones nobody expected to survive. The first ambulance screamed through the bay doors at 2:53 a.m. Then another. Then 3 more, all within 90 seconds. The parking lot outside transformed into a landing zone, red and white lights strobing across the rain-soaked pavement like a war zone triage point. Inside, residents froze in practiced panic. They had trained for this. They had never actually done this. Sarah didn't freeze. The 4th ambulance brought the Army Ranger captain from Helmand Province, and she knew it before they even wheeled him in. She could read it in a paramedic's eyes, the particular flavor of controlled terror that came from knowing you were delivering a patient with minutes left to live. He was shirtless on the stretcher, his entire left side painted in blood the color of rust, and his chest was doing something chests shouldn't do. It was caving inward on one side like a fist being slowly closed. Tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed. Air was filling the space around it, compressing the heart, crushing the vessels. Every breath he took made it worse. 28-year-old male, gunshot wound left anterior chest, penetrating trauma, vitals at scene were BP 110/65, last recorded 88/52 and dropping, the paramedic was saying, talking fast, his voice tight with the particular urgency of someone who knew the clock was running down. Decreased breath sounds left side, tracheal deviation starting, we got 2 large bore 4s, he's been conscious the entire transport but. The ranger captain's eyes found hers. Not a request. Recognition. Sarah moved to the head of the bed, and the residents parted like water around a stone. The attending physician, a man named Dr. Rothstein who'd graduated medical school 6 years ago and had never seen anything worse than a motorcycle accident, opened his mouth to give orders. Nothing came out. O2 sat. Sarah asked, not looking away from the monitor. 68 and falling, the tech said. BP's 82/40 now. The fluorescent lights above hummed their electric funeral song. 3 minutes. Maybe 4 before his blood pressure dropped below the threshold where his brain could survive. Below that, you weren't saving a life anymore. You were harvesting organs. Sarah's hands moved like they were operated by someone else. Like the person holding the needle was a ghost of herself, a field medic who'd done this in a patrol base in Helmand Province when the closest surgeon was 40 miles away and a helicopter was 20 minutes out. She prepped the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with a movement so economical it looked like she was reaching for a pen. The 14-gauge needle went in without hesitation, and the moment the metal touched the skin, she knew exactly how much pressure the resistance would feel like, knew exactly the depth, knew exactly when the pop would come. The pop came. Air hissed out like a tire deflating, like the sound of a battlefield compress being applied, like the sound of pressure releasing. O2 sat climbing, the tech said. 72, 78. 85, 90. Dr. Rothstein stood frozen, his mouth still open. The other residents stared like they'd just watched someone perform surgery without consent, without protocol, without the 3-year certification that said she was allowed to do this. The ranger captain's eyes met hers again. For a single instant, his pupils focused. Recognition became something deeper. Acknowledgement. Heart rate stabilizing, the tech said. BP coming up. 95/50. Good pressure. The needle decompression was supposed to be temporary. Temporary was supposed to mean the attending physician would perform it, would authorize it, would take responsibility for it. It was supposed to mean the resident would assist, would learn, would eventually move forward in their career without anyone asking hard questions about who actually saved that man's life. Sarah had performed the needle decompression without hesitation and therefore without permission, without consultation, and therefore in direct violation of hospital policy 4.7.2, scope of practice restrictions. She had performed it in full view of 12 witnesses. She had performed it while Dr. Marcus Mercer was not in the hospital, could not approve it, could not control it. He arrived at 3:53 a.m. 1 hour. Exactly enough time for the rapid response team to wheel the ranger captain to the ICU, for his condition to stabilize, for the surgical team to prepare for emergency thoracotomy, for the nurses to document Sarah's needle decompression in the medical record where it would live forever as evidence of either heroism or recklessness depending on who was reading it. Mercer didn't come congratulate her. He came with a manila folder thick as a dictionary, and his smile was the smile of a predator who'd finally identified where his prey slept. He found her outside the ICU, her hand still stained with the ranger captain's blood because she hadn't stopped moving long enough to wash, and he handed her the folder without speaking. Inside were incident reports. Fabricated incident reports, all stamped with official hospital letterhead and dated 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks before the mass casualty incident, 3 weeks before the needle decompression, 3 weeks before any of this had even happened. Unauthorized procedures. Practicing beyond scope of licensure. Operating under false credentials. Misrepresentation of nursing certification. Violation of 12 separate Joint Commission regulations. Joint Commission Regulation 47B clearly states that unauthorized clinical procedures performed by non-physician personnel constitute grounds for immediate license revocation, Mercer said, his voice the color of polished steel. He tapped the folder with a finger that looked like it had never performed surgery, never actually saved a life, never held anything more precious than a fountain pen. This documentation has been compiled over 3 weeks and submitted to the State Nursing Board as of 6 p.m. this evening. Unless you resign tonight, they'll revoke your license within 30 days. She just saved his life, Dr. Rothstein said from across the hallway, his voice small, uncertain, but present. That procedure was textbook. That was. Dr. Rothstein, I suggest you document your own role in this unauthorized procedure before you advocate for the person who performed it, Mercer said without looking at him. You stood there silent while a nurse performed emergency surgery. What do you think the Joint Commission will say about your supervision? The color drained from Rothstein's face like someone had pulled a plug. Mercer looked back at Sarah, and his smile widened because he could see exactly what he'd accomplished. He'd created a situation where praising her meant condemning yourself. He'd weaponized protocol so thoroughly that heroism became a liability. Your access to the ICU is suspended effective immediately, he continued. The charge nurse has instructions that security will escort you from the ward if you attempt entry. You'll remain assigned to the outpatient clinic until your termination papers are finalized. If you resign tonight, we can characterize this as a mutual agreement. If you don't, this goes public, and every hospital in the system removes your name from their system by morning. Do you understand? Sarah held the folder. Inside were typewritten lies that had been drafted 3 weeks ago, before the accident, before the emergency, before the ranger captain had even been born into the kind of night that ends in trauma bays. Inside were accusations that would disqualify her from practice in 47 states. Inside was the documentation of someone who'd been planning this moment longer than she'd been planning to save that soldier's life. I understand, she said quietly. Good. I'll expect your resignation by tomorrow morning. He turned to walk away, but Sarah's voice stopped him like a physical force, her tone the color of iron. The ranger captain in Bay 4 was coding by the time I performed that decompression. Bilateral pneumothorax, tension physiology, tracheal deviation. He had 3 minutes maximum before cardiac arrest. The pressure inside his thoracic cavity was probably 18 to 22 centimeters of water. You want to tell me what your protocol would have been while he was flatlining? Mercer didn't turn around. He kept walking, his footsteps echoing off the tile like they belonged to someone who'd already won, who'd already calculated every consequence and found them acceptable. I'm going on break, Sarah said to no one in particular, even though it was 4 a.m. and there was no break coming, not for weeks, not until something broke open and revealed what had been hidden. She walked to the employee bathroom and locked the door and sat on the edge of the toilet with a manila folder in her hands. Outside, Atlanta was still dark. Still raining. Still the same city it had been 1 hour ago, except now somewhere in a hospital bed, an Army Ranger captain was breathing air that a night shift nurse had given back to him. He was alive because she'd refused to freeze. He was alive because she'd chosen the patient over the protocol, chosen the soldier over the hospital, chosen the mission over her own survival. She'd just destroyed her cover to save a fellow soldier. And somewhere in this hospital, a man named Marcus Mercer was walking back to his office to pour a drink and celebrate, never knowing that the woman he'd just fired with fabricated documents had been here specifically to document every fraudulent procedure he'd performed. Down in the recovery bay, the combat medic who'd wheeled himself through the ER 4 hours ago, the grizzled sergeant who'd served in Kandahar and now lived with a permanent spinal cord injury, turned to his wife and whispered a single word, Reaper. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have. Sarah gripped it against her chest as she walked past the security desk, the same desk where she'd flashed her badge every night for 18 months, the same officers who'd waved her through without looking up. Tonight they looked up. Tonight they watched her leave. She didn't make eye contact. The invisibility that had protected her for 1.5 years was gone, burned away in a surgical strike orchestrated by a man whose arrogance had finally met its match. Except he didn't know that. That was the only victory left to her. Behind her, the glass doors of Cedar Creek Medical slid open with a pneumatic hiss. The Atlanta night air hit her face, humid, oppressive, carrying the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and diesel exhaust from the loading dock. 4:15 in the morning. The time stamped on her termination papers. The moment she stopped being Nurse Sarah Chen and became a ghost again. "You're done here." Mercer's voice had been so controlled, so certain. He'd stood in the ICU with those fabricated incident reports arranged in front of her like a hand of cards he'd been holding since the moment she'd questioned his infection rates. The manila folder had grown thick over weeks, unauthorized procedures, practicing beyond scope, falsified credentials, each citation pulled from Joint Commission regulations like a magician's scarves, each one meaningless if you knew how to read between the lines. What Mercer didn't know was that she'd already seen versions of this folder. In her real job. In her actual life. Security had waited in the hallway, their uniforms crisp and impersonal, their job reduced to logistics. Escort the threat out. Collect the badge. Document the time. They hadn't known they were removing a decorated officer from an active Pentagon investigation into their employer's fraud. They were just following orders. Sarah understood that. She'd spent her entire career following orders that looked insane to people who didn't have clearance to understand them. The hospital lobby was empty at this hour, just the night custodian pushing a floor buffer near the surgical wing, the sound of it rolling like distant thunder. Sarah had walked past him hundreds of times. He'd never looked at her. Nobody ever did. That was the architecture of being invisible in a uniform. You existed in the spaces between people's attention. She'd handed over her badge without argument. The plastic rectangle, blue with white lettering, her photograph from 3 years ago when the Pentagon had embedded her here, had felt warm in her palm. How long had she been carrying it? Long enough that it had absorbed her body heat. Long enough that it felt like a part of her. "I understand, Doctor," she'd said. Her voice had been soft. Compliant. The voice of a nurse who'd been caught overstepping, who deserved what was coming. The voice that had bought her 18 months of trust. Mercer's smile had been surgical, precise, bloodless, designed to inflict damage without leaving visible marks. "I'm sure the state board will review your case thoroughly. These things take time." He'd meant it as a threat. A nurse under investigation didn't work anywhere. The bureaucracy would choke the life out of her career. But Mercer didn't know that her career existed in a classified folder in the Pentagon, that her name appeared in citations he'd never have clearance to read, that everything he'd just done had been documented by people whose authority made his look like a hall monitor's. What he'd accomplished was simpler and more final. He'd burned her cover. The bus stop was half a block from the hospital's main entrance, and the rain had started somewhere around 4 o'clock, the kind of Atlanta downpour that came without warning, that turned the air into something you had to breathe rather than something that existed around you. Sarah stood under the bus shelter's aluminum roof, watching water stream down the plexiglass panels, watching the parking lot lights blur into halos. The cardboard box sat on the bench beside her. She'd packed it while Mercer was talking to the administrator. 80 seconds to gather the 18 months of her undercover life. Not much to show for it. The cracked mug was on top, white ceramic with faded blue letters, "World's Okayest Nurse." She'd bought it at a gas station gift shop on her first day, a generic armor for blending in. Nurses collected those mugs, the self-deprecating humor required cultural script. She had 47 of them in a storage unit in Arlington. This one was the only one that mattered because it was the only one that had been present. The only one that had been part of the story. Next to the mug was the succulent. Withered. Brown at the edges. A plant had no chance in a hospital, the air was too recycled, the humidity too controlled. She'd kept it alive anyway, moving it away from the vents, misting it with distilled water stolen from the pharmacy. Another performance. Another piece of the mask. Nurses kept plants. Nurses watered them. Nurses cared about growing things. But the photograph was what made the box real. 5 soldiers in tactical gear, Kandahar Province, 2019. A rooftop at dawn with the Hindu Kush Mountains blurred in the background. Sarah stood third from the left, her face barely visible under her helmet, one arm across the shoulders of Captain Marcus Bear Holloway, 2 years older than her, from Raleigh, married to a woman named Jennifer who'd sent him care packages every month until the day in June when a Taliban IED had turned a routine patrol into a memorial service. Next to Bear was Sergeant Robert Espinoza. Native American from Santa Fe. 2 tours before this one. An MH-6 Little Bird had been his dream. He'd wanted to fly assault helicopters after his service ended. He'd made it to the airport in Qatar before the infection took him. Post-op sepsis. Preventable sepsis. The kind that happened when field surgeons did the work of doctors, when there wasn't enough training or equipment or time. Staff Sergeant David "Breaker" Torres had been there too, the man in recovery downstairs, the one whose presence in this hospital had triggered the entire investigation. He'd survived. That was the word the Army used, survived. As if living through an IED blast was the same as winning. And then Lance Corporal James Chen, no relation, though she'd been asked 1,000 times. 22 years old from Sacramento. Had wanted to be a veterinarian before he'd enlisted. Had a guitar he played on nights the patrol base got quiet. He died in her arms during a medevac hop back to the hospital because the chest wound was too compromised and the flight surgeon said sometimes the body just decides to stop. She'd held pressure on his sternum for 47 minutes while the helicopter crossed desert terrain that didn't care if someone was dying in its belly. The photograph didn't show any of that. It just showed 5 soldiers smiling at the camera, lit by dawn light, alive in the way that people only understand after they've seen what alive could have been lost. Sarah had never taken the photograph out at Cedar Creek Medical. Never looked at it in the break room or her locker. The one time a colleague had asked about the frame on her shelf, she'd said, "Old friends," and changed the subject. You didn't carry your real life into an undercover assignment. You carried echoes. You carried enough to stay human, not enough to compromise the mission. She reached into the box, past the mug and the plant, and felt the plastic wrap. Cool against her fingertips. The flag was underneath, folded into the precise triangle that the honor guard had produced during James Chen's funeral in Sacramento. His mother had pressed it into Sarah's hands afterward and said something that Sarah's brain had refused to process for 3 years. He'd want you to have it. He talked about you like you were his sister. Sarah had never corrected her. Never said, "I'm just his unit commander." She'd taken the flag and put it somewhere it couldn't haunt her, and now it was wrapped in grocery store plastic in a cardboard box on a bus bench in Atlanta, 18 months past the last time she'd allowed herself to think about James's mother. The rain hammered the shelter's roof like applause for something nobody had won. Her phone buzzed. Single text. Unknown number, but she knew the number. Same handler who'd recruited her 18 months ago, the same voice that had said, "We need someone who's already in the shadows. Someone the hospital won't see. Mission compromised. Extract immediately. Investigation suspended. Investigation suspended." 3 words that meant the fraud documentation would be sealed. The evidence she'd gathered, the billing codes, the surgical records, the pattern of unnecessary procedures that had cost veterans their health and the VA $30 million, all of it would go into a folder classified above her clearance level. The investigation would continue without her. Or it wouldn't. That decision would be made by people whose names she would never know, who would never know her name either. Justice didn't work like this, she'd learned. Justice took time and bureaucracy and the kind of patience that civilian life didn't teach. Justice let bad men keep teaching you how you'd failed. Justice let you stand in the rain at 4:30 in the morning holding a cardboard box that contained a folded flag and the knowledge that you'd chosen orders over the soldiers downstairs in recovery. Torres would heal. His spinal injury was permanent, he'd never walk without assistance, never return to operational duty, but he'd live. That should have been enough. It should have been the victory she carried with her. But Mercer would stay. That was the part the rain couldn't wash away. He'd stay in Cedar Creek Medical, harvesting money from soldiers' pain, generating incident reports about nurses who noticed things, and nobody would stop him. Not today. Not this week. Maybe not for months. Sarah pulled the photograph from the box and looked at Bear's smile. Bear, who'd died because his femoral artery had severed and even field surgery couldn't stop what had already stopped. Bear, whose wife Jennifer had sent her a Christmas card 2 years ago with a photo of their daughter, she must be 8 now, who would grow up knowing her father only through stories and pictures and the specific way grief shaped a woman's face. She stared at the photograph until the rain blurred it. Until the faces dissolved into just color and light. Then she put it back in the box, wrapped the flag around it more carefully, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her phone was already in her hand. Not the text from her handler. A different phone. A burner. A number for emergencies only. She'd never used it. She'd never had to. But everything that had happened in the last 4 hours was an emergency wearing a medical license and a surgical smile. She dialed. The voice that answered was clipped, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone trained for calls at 4:30 in the morning. This is command. Identify. Captain Sarah Chen, Army Ranger, 75th Regiment, call sign Reaper, she said. Embedded asset Cedar Creek Medical, Atlanta, Georgia. I'm calling in a compromise protocol. A pause. Not confusion. Just the sound of someone pulling up files, finding her dossier, reading the clearance levels. Understood, Captain. Sit tight. We're activating extraction and alerting DOD. Maintain position. The line went dead. Sarah set the phone down on the bench next to the cardboard box. The rain drummed the shelter's roof. Somewhere in the city, in Pentagon offices and command centers she'd never been to, classified conversations were beginning. Calls were being made. A 2-star general was probably being woken up. An investigation that had been suspended was about to become very UN suspended. Dr. Marcus Mercer didn't know any of this yet. He was probably asleep, his hands folded across the satisfaction of having eliminated a threat. He'd tell his wife about the difficult personnel decision he'd had to make. He'd sleep well, knowing that the problem had been handled, the paperwork was comprehensive, the testimony of a disgruntled nurse wouldn't stand against his reputation. But that was before sunrise. That was before the helicopters. And standing in the rain with a cardboard box containing the only pieces of her real life she'd been allowed to carry, Sarah waited for the world to break open, and she thought about Bear's smile, and about the orders that had made her choose a mission over her people, and about what true justice actually looked like when it finally arrived. 3 days later, Dr. Marcus Mercer stormed into Patricia Hall's office at Cedar Creek Medical with the fury of a man watching his empire collapse. His tie hung loose around his neck like a noose he hadn't quite finished tightening. The manila folder in his hands was thick with fabricated incident reports, unauthorized procedures, practicing beyond scope, falsified credentials, a paper trail he'd been constructing for weeks with the precision of someone accustomed to getting away with things. Patricia Hall sat behind her desk, fingers steepled, waiting. She'd already received the Pentagon call. She just hadn't told him yet. This is unacceptable. Mercer's voice climbed an octave with each word, the tone of a man who'd never been told no by someone who actually held power. That nurse, Sarah Chen, needs to be terminated immediately. Her license needs to be revoked. I want it documented that I flagged her insubordination months ago, that I repeatedly warned. The intercom on Patricia's desk crackled. Ms. Hall, Captain Torres is awake. He's asking for the night shift nurse. Patricia's expression didn't change. She reached for her computer, pulled up the incident report, and turned the monitor toward Mercer. There, clipped to the file, was Sarah's employee photograph. Young. Competent. Unremarkable. The kind of face people forgot. He wants her now, the voice continued. He's agitated. Says it's important. In room 304, Captain David Torres regained consciousness for the first time in 72 hours, his chest wrapped in surgical dressing, his lungs finally expanding without the crushing weight of pressure that should have killed him. The attending physician, a former Marine named Dr. Holloway, was reviewing the incident report when the captain's eyes opened, dark and alert like a hawk that had been asleep but never stopped hunting. Torres saw the photograph clipped to the file on the desk. One word escaped his lips, barely a whisper but carrying the weight of recognition, Reaper. Dr. Holloway's hands went still. He looked at the photograph. Then at Torres. Then back at the photograph. In the Marine Corps, you learned certain things about certain names, certain call signs that belonged to people who weren't supposed to exist in the conventional world. Reaper was one of them. Your night shift nurse, Holloway said carefully, already understanding what Torres had just confirmed with a single word. He pulled the full medical file, cross-referenced the personnel records, and there it was, embedded so perfectly that only someone looking for it would see it. Captain Sarah Chen, embedded operative, Pentagon assignment, classified details redacted in thick black lines that covered more text than they revealed. The citation was there too, visible beneath the redactions: Silver Star Favela, Helmand Province, 12 soldiers saved, mission completion under hostile conditions. The physician who'd spent his entire career healing people suddenly understood he'd been standing next to a legend and calling her just a nurse. The door to Patricia Hall's office burst open. 2 soldiers entered first, the kind of precision movement that came from training measured in years and miles and lives saved. Then came the general. 2 stars on his shoulder, bearing the weight of decisions that shifted wars and the kind of authority that made hospital administrators stand without being asked. General Martin Wright, Deputy Director of Special Operations Command, had flown from the Pentagon the moment the call came in. Behind him came 4 investigators in tactical gear bearing the insignia of the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Dr. Mercer, the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, controlled, absolutely certain of its own inevitability. You've been operating an undercover investigation in your facility for 8 months and didn't know it. Mercer's face cycled through colors. Confusion first. Then indignation. Then the dawning realization of what was about to happen. This is absurd. She's just a nurse. She's a captain, General Wright corrected, his tone suggesting this was the last time he'd correct anything. And she's been documenting your fraudulent billing practices, your kickback schemes, and the systematic complications arising from your unnecessary procedures performed on vulnerable veteran patients for profit. The investigators moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators. They didn't speak. They simply presented findings. Fraudulent billing codes verified through 3 separate audits. Shell company purchases traced to Mercer's accounts. Patient records altered to hide complication rates. Financial transfers from device manufacturers totaling $847,000. Surgical procedures performed that existed only in billing documents, never in operating room records. 17 additional cases across the VA system following the same pattern, all discovered after Captain Chen's initial documentation. Total fraudulent billing recovered for $0.7 million. That evidence was gathered illegally, Mercer's attorney would say later. Those records were obtained without. But that was later. Right now, in Patricia Hall's office, Mercer stood in the presence of someone with the authority to end things, and his voice became shrill, desperate, the sound of a man watching the architecture of his empire collapse into rubble. This is insane. I'm a board-certified surgeon. I've been on staff here for 18 years. You can't just. We can and we are, General Wright said. Captain Chen's investigation is classified. Your investigation is not. The FBI received our findings at 0600 this morning. You'll be contacted within the hour regarding criminal charges. Your hospital privileges suspend immediately. Ms. Hall, this facility is under federal audit as of right now. Mercer left the office. He didn't walk, he shuffled, as if gravity had suddenly increased its pull on him, as if the weight of what was coming had already crushed the spine that once held him upright. 24 hours later, the Georgia Medical Board received the Pentagon findings. Mercer hired 3 attorneys. They argued procedural technicalities. They filed motions to exclude evidence. They suggested alternative explanations for the financial transfers. It didn't matter. The audit was thorough. The evidence was overwhelming. Within a week, his medical license was suspended pending investigation. Within a month, it was revoked. The surgical residents who'd once laughed at his mockery of Sarah now testified about his intimidation tactics, his demands that they falsify documentation, his shortcuts that endangered patients. His wife filed for separation when the news outlets published the headline, "Decorated Army Ranger Captain Worked Undercover as Nurse to Expose VA Fraud." The humiliation was so complete, so total, that it seemed almost merciful when the criminal charges came: 15 counts of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the federal government. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Veterans testified about complications from unnecessary procedures Mercer had performed specifically to inflate billing. The combat medic from room 304, Rodriguez, described watching Mercer dismiss legitimate concerns while pushing profitable but risky interventions. Sarah, now in dress uniform with captain's bars visible, provided expert testimony about the investigation, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd seen the cost of corruption measured in lives. The jury deliberated for hours. Guilty on 12 counts. By winter, Marcus Mercer stood in front of a classroom at Riverside Community College, teaching CPR fundamentals for $16 an hour to students who didn't know his name but whispered it anyway when they recognized his face from news coverage. He pressed his hands down on a plastic dummy's chest, demonstrating compressions with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done the same motion thousands of times but never with the weight that came with saving a human life. The students watched. Nobody clapped. Nobody took notes. They just watched. His former office at Cedar Creek Medical became a patient advocacy center. His name was removed from the hospital wing he'd once funded. His patients' files were transferred to other physicians who'd never heard the infection rate statistics that had driven Sarah to risk everything to document the truth. 3 months after the verdict, Sarah stood in the Cedar Creek Medical Chapel where a memorial wall now honored military healthcare workers. Her Ranger team's flag hung in a place of honor beside photographs of the 12 soldiers she'd saved in Helmand Province. The memorial was simple, just photographs and names and dates, but it carried the weight of lives protected, of sacrifices made, of people who'd walked into danger and never walked back out. Captain David Torres stood beside her in dress uniform with matching captain's bars, recovered fully from his injuries, his chest healed in ways that extended beyond the physical. His breathing was steady. His eyes were clear. The weight of her hand saving his life was visible in the way he carried himself now, not with arrogance, but with gratitude that ran bone deep. General Wright presented Sarah with a commendation for her undercover work. Her investigation had led to 17 additional fraud cases across the VA system. The recovery had reached $4.7 million. The message was simple and delivered with the kind of precision that military ceremony demands: you did your job. You did it perfectly. You saved lives. Patricia Hall offered Sarah a permanent position as Director of Veteran Patient Advocacy. Sarah declined. She was returning to active duty, training combat medics at Fort Benning, teaching the next generation what real medicine looked like when you had nothing but your hands and your training and the absolute refusal to let someone die on your watch. Spring sun broke through Atlanta clouds as Sarah walked past the bus stop where she'd stood with her cardboard box months earlier, now wearing her uniform openly. The fear was gone. The invisibility was finished. She walked like someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. A young nursing student approached nervously, recognizing her from news coverage, asking if the rumors were true. "Did you really perform field surgery while undercover?" Sarah smiled. "I did what needed doing. That's the job." The student hesitated, then asked the question that seemed to matter more than all the others: what does heroism really mean? Sarah glanced at the hospital where veterans received care now, glanced at the memorial wall visible through chapel windows, at the flag representing those who never came home. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If you found Captain Chen's story as powerful as I did, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the quiet heroes walking among us. Drop a comment below: what would you have done in her position? And if you know someone who sacrificed everything for what's right, tag them in the comments. Let them know you see them.